Hi everyone, welcome back from the break. So far, we've had a roundtable discussion and fireside chat that provided solutions-focused perspectives on systemic health issues highlighted by the pandemic. That will continue into the afternoon, so I'm excited to see where the conversation will take us. Now I'd like to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Claire Melamed, who is the CEO of Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. So without solid data, it's difficult to have strong research and implementation. And there's a need for all sectors to be engaged in these efforts beyond just the private sector. Today's upcoming discussion is a great follow-up to yesterday's fireside chat with Arturo Franco and Dr. Neal Mikhailov about leveraging data and digital technology for social good. So it's an honor to welcome Dr. Claire Melamed. Claire, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Anita, and thank you everyone. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. I'm hugely excited, and obviously the topics that you're addressing over these few days of the Reach Symposium go absolutely to the heart of everything that we all, I think, are trying to do to recover well from COVID, to tackle the climate crisis, and make sure that all of our efforts are pointing in the direction of a better and fairer world. And as you said, Anita, it's data really that underpins so much of what we're trying to do. It's the data that tells us what the problems are, that helps us to analyse where there are inequalities, where there are vulnerabilities, where there are crises that we need to address. It's data that can help to point the direction, to give that picture of progress and show us where we want to be. And then it's data at the very granular level, data on service delivery, data on progress for different groups that can show us whether or not we're on the right path, and help governments, help companies, help civil society organisations to make sure that they're using all their resources in the best possible way to achieve the objectives that we all want to achieve. Now, in a minute, I'm going to be joined by a fantastic panel who will talk and we'll have a very practical conversation about some of the specific ways in which data can do that, and some of the work that they're doing that will help us to make sure that we know where we're going, we know that we are on the best possible route to get there. But first of all, I want to spend a few minutes talking today about the data system and how to make sure that we are thinking about data, that we're governing data, that we're using data in a way which is complementary, which helps us to achieve the world that we want, and that we're not inadvertently undermining all of the objectives that we want to see by creating a world of data which excludes people, which isn't accountable, and which doesn't help to drive the action that we really want. So if we can go to the next slide, please. We can have the next slide. Thank you. So data, let's just recap. Data obviously is absolutely critical in powering progress. Data is the heart of economic opportunity. Of the businesses have always relied on data, sometimes very granular data on, sort of right from the market traders of hundreds and even thousands of years ago, counting their stock and understanding the prices they were paying. Of course, now we have huge opportunities for business to have real-time data, to use data as a fantastic resource powering progress. Data gives us economic opportunities that we could never have dreamt of. Data is the absolute heart of policy change, of delivering services well, of knowing whether we're reaching the hardest to reach populations, of understanding how policies, how the things that governments and institutions do are affecting the lives of people. And data is also at the heart of accountability, of citizens being able to understand whether their governments or other powerful institutions are working for them and making sure that their resources are being used well, and sometimes protesting and insisting on change if they think that things are not going their way. Data is absolutely critical, but data itself is part of a political system. It's produced in the context of that political system. So how can we make sure that the power of data is used for good? Next slide, please. The Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data has just finished a year-long consultation with our 600 plus partners that involved hundreds of people, hours of consultations, many fantastic inputs, discussions, challenges. And we fixed on three things that our community agrees on. which are really central to making sure that we're building the kind of data systems that in turn can help us to build the world that we want. And the first key idea, if we can go to the next slide, please, is the idea of agency. People have to have some kind of agent, be represented in the data in ways that they recognise, that reflect the things that they think are important. And too often we've seen that people are represented in data in ways that reflect what people in power think are worth recording. So, for example, many issues that affect women's lives are systematically under-resourced, undercounted, because women traditionally have not been in positions of power that can make decisions about what data is collected. And this is increasingly a kind of site of discussion, of advocacy among those groups who are advocating for their rights. So increasingly seeing data as a really critical vehicle and lens through which to do that. One of the most electrifying moments for me in the last year of consultations was when we heard from Gwen Phillips, who is a First Nations data governance champion, part of a growing movement of Indigenous people who are advocating for data sovereignty, for Indigenous communities' rights to govern the collection and the ownership of their own data. We can go to the next slide. And Gwen says so powerfully why this is absolutely critical to shifting power. And she says, and I mean, you can see the quote here, there's a brilliant, if you, on our Global Partnership website, you can hear there's a little, there's a video where you can hear Gwen saying this. It's so powerful. She says, we don't want to be counted in a way that just tells us how bad things are and how dysfunctional we are, but we want to collect the data on the things that show us also about our strengths and the assets that we have in our community. And this is so critical, that data reflects how people see themselves and the strengths, as well as, of course, the weaknesses and the challenges that they think they have. So the first central idea of building a better data system that can help us to drive the better policy that we need is the idea of agency. Next slide. The second idea is accountability. And we need to make sure that the people who control data, the people that produce data, the people that govern and use data are accountable to citizens as we would expect in any other part of democratic processes. This isn't just about data privacy. Often the debates about governance get sort of compressed into a single idea around privacy, and that's important, but accountability goes very, very far beyond that. And what we're talking about is a very complex idea of trade-offs and levels. It's not simply about because data obviously has a group benefit as well as an individual benefit, and we need to make these decisions collectively about data so that we can all benefit. And it's really about participatory mechanisms here that give people the influence and the power to shape how data governance solutions are designed and implemented and enforced to increase the accountability of decision makers. This needs to happen at lots of different levels. If we go to the next slide, we'll see this next slide is a quote from one of our partners, the Data Pop Alliance, and it's really describing how they made sure that they had accountability at the local level, at the project level of a project they were working on, and accountability not just at the end, not just that they produced something and then asked people if they liked it or not, but they actually gave people control and accountability over the whole process of the project and the way that data was collected and visualized and responded to people's concerns. So accountability can happen at a local level, at different stages of a project. Next slide. Accountability obviously also has to happen at a national level, and the whole architecture of rules and regulations is a critical element of accountability. This slide, of course, you can see shows the results of a lawsuit that was taken about a decision that the UK government had made about about sharing citizens' data with a private company. So we need to think about how we're building accountability into the system at all sorts of different levels, depending on the project, depending on where we're at. And the third idea that's absolutely critical in terms of making sure that we're building a system, next slide please, which can really support people's aspirations, is the idea of action. one of the big we talk a lot about data gaps in our community and all the things that we don't know. And there are lots of really important things that we don't know that we should know, not least about some of the most vulnerable people. But the other deep frustration that we have is the huge amount of data which we do have, but which is unused, which is untapped, which is hidden away in a silo, people don't know about, can't be combined with other kinds of data. So we really need to think about building a data system which is absolutely geared towards action, and a system which can maximize our chances of using the data that we have at the right level, in the right way, by the right institutions to influence those decisions that can improve people's lives. And here it's really about some sort of very untechnical and undatory things about culture and institutions and politics, and really thinking about how we get people to work together. People are always at the heart of the system, to make sure that the data that we do use is mobilized for action. And I think, this is so important. If we go to the next slide, please. Data comes from human interactions, and we sometimes forget that. Even if this picture, I was here when this picture was taken. This is a picture of a survey enumerator taking data from men, as you can see in Ghana. We're asking people to give up their time, to give up their precious private information and ideas, and we have an obligation to use that well when we've asked people to in a sense trust us with their information. And when it goes, next slide please, when it goes well, it can be so critical. This is a quote from somebody in Kenya, a survey enumerator who was involved in some work that we did, that we worked with the government of Kenya in collecting data on food prices in the context of COVID, and really trying to use that data to make sure that people were protected from price rises. And it just shows, I think, that the sort of bias for action has to run right up and down the system, from the individual enumerators right up to the political culture, which ensures that data is used and that makes decision makers committed to using data to drive their action. So these three ideas of agency, of accountability and action need to be, our network believes, need to be at the heart of how we think about all of the small projects and all of the bigger programs that we do, that we are all working on every day, to make sure that collectively we're building the kind of data system which can be part of the solution. And I think really the one thing to leave you with at the heart of this is the idea that if we're thinking about data, we have to always think about doing data with people and not doing data to people. Thank you. Really looking forward to taking forward some of these ideas in the discussion. Back to you, Anita.
Thank you so much, Claire, for your insightful, nuanced remarks on data and its role in driving positive social change. I'm really looking forward to digging deeper into some of your ideas in the upcoming panel discussion. So just as a reminder to everybody watching, please submit your questions at any time throughout the conversation. I'll be bringing them to our guests following the discussion. So today's panel is called How to Responsibly Use Data and Digital Technology to Achieve the SDGs. Claire is joined by policy analyst at the Government of Canada and REACH alumni, Angela Miniho, global head of the Tableau Foundation, Neal Myrick, and digital ID policy lead at Access Now, Verónica Arroyo. Claire, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anita. Welcome to Angela, Verónica, and Neal. It's great to be with you today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So, for everybody listening, it'll be a very familiar format to you all. I'm going to ask a few questions. We'll get a discussion going here, but we're really, really keen to hear from you. So please do submit your questions, and I can't promise to answer all of them, but certainly some of them I will be able to put to this panel. So let's start off in a sense, where I left off, that we all understand, I think we all agree that data is really important and that it's a really critical part of the infrastructure that we're trying to develop for a better world. All of you in your different ways are the builders of that system and are working all the time, in different ways at the project level, program level, through national systems. And let me turn to you, Neal. Obviously, through the Tableau Foundation and through Tableau, absolutely at the heart of some of the data systems across the world, both in governments and in the private sector. And I think while we understand the potential of data, we all, I think, also understand that the lack of capacity, resources, security can make realising those opportunities quite a challenge, and particularly, of course, for the people that are the subject of this symposium, those hardest to reach populations. So just talk us through some of the practical factors that that you've been considering and some of the successes that you've had in really leveraging those opportunities under all those constraints for those hardest to reach populations.
Thank you, Claire. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the REACH Symposium for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be part of this panel. Claire, I feel like even though you and I haven't spoken for a while, we've had this sort of mind meld because what you just shared just aligns so perfectly with how we view the world of data in our work at Tableau Foundation. There's really two buckets of answers here. One is on the actual systems side. When governments are considering building systems to collect the data, and there are really like three things that we think about. One is the groups that are the most successful really start with the data they have. And what we've learned is the more they use and understand the data they have, the better informed they are in how to build out and improve the systems that they have. So start with what you have, learn, and build that learning into how you think about iteratively building your new systems. We also think about building systems intentionally and iteratively. So instead of doing like a big multi-year project that kind of thuds on the desk with something, just start small and build quickly and iteratively, and being intentional about why you're building the system and who you're building it for, and who's represented in the system. And then three, we've seen with organizations like PATH that we've partnered with for a long time, we've seen that regional systems can be beneficial. So if there's a system that can be shared among multiple ministries or multiple groups, you can ramp up faster, even if the long term is for each group to have its own system. A shared system lets you ramp up quickly and get value from data sooner. And then really quick, just three other points that align with what you talked about. We always encourage people to engage communities in helping decide what data are collected about them. And then when those data are collected and when the data are being interpreted, engage the communities in helping interpret the data so that the interpretations can be culturally relevant and authentic. And then lastly, as you pointed out, Claire, be intentional about who you're trying to reach. We have a number of projects going on that are focused on intentionally reaching women, because we know that if things are left to the status quo, women get left out. And we have to be very intentional about wanting to reach women. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neal. No, I think really good points. And I love your point about intentionality. We have to sort of decide what we want to do and build from there. Verónica, I mean, a similar question to you really about how one goes about this in a practical sense, obviously coming from your background more as a lawyer and a civil society advocate, really interested to sort of understand a bit more about how you're seeing these, what you think are the big challenges in the practical proposition of trying to actually build out these kind of systems that really can benefit everybody.
Thank you very much for that question, and I'm very happy to join everyone here. Thank you for the invitation. And your question really, I really like the question because it shows the reasoning behind one of the campaigns that we have at Access Now. We are an international organization that works, defends human rights of people at risk around the world. And this campaign is the YID campaign. And obviously, it talks really about what your question is about, because we have seen that governments around the world and also donors and international organizations are, working towards getting done this SDGs, the goals that we all know, and particularly regarding providing legal identity as a tool to provide other services, right? However, there are populations and there are countries, we're talking mainly to developing countries, where these things don't work as promised. And there is why the reason of our campaign. Our campaign relies on understanding the reality of why a digital ID system or any technology, but this can be expanded to other spectrums and other spaces, is needed in a particular country. And that relies also on having the data that you mentioned before. It's having resources to understand what's going on in the country, and that help us to understand, for example, that maybe in some countries there are structural discrimination, like in Kenya, or maybe there are already surveillance concerns, as in Argentina, or very poor logistics or very poor access to technologies, like in India. So if we add this layer of technology or any digital technology to provide more things, maybe we're gonna arrive to a point where the situation gets worse than it was before. And we have seen these cases. So for us, it's quite important to be very realistic on what is the situation of a country. There is where the data is important to know exactly what's going on, what are the problems, and then decide, and then start the conversation about the design, about like how to make the situation of or anything that we want to propose better. Those are different in questions and discussions that we're going to have at some point. But before any discussion, any decision, we need to have that data. We need to have that complete understanding of the reality. And that also, something that you mentioned in your presentation that caught up my attention regarding the agency and accountability. For us at the moment of understanding the reality of every country, because every policy should be shaped accordingly, goes through also having a very high participation of many stakeholders. That's a way to understand, to have a full picture of any issue or any problem. For us specifically, is about how identity is shaping, our realities and our daily activities. So for us, having a multi-stakeholder approach is also another practical way to achieve these goals. Civil society, from what I come in here, also it's crucial to understand these points, to give this agency, to provide this accountability that you mentioned, because sometimes civil society and advocates such as me or any other people that I know work with grassroots organizations, and we're kind of closer to things that are happening. And also we can be this bridge between what's going on and the decision makers. So I think this is something that we can highlight from our past experience.
Thank you so much. Really interesting. The little blips that you can hear as you speak are all of the questions coming in from the audience. So there's a huge amount of really, really interesting questions. So I'm very keen that we should get to them. And I think some of the other topics that I was hoping to discuss in this panel discussion will in fact be part of the conversation with the audience. But before we do that, Angela, I think this is a really great moment to bring you in, and particularly following on from those points about the sort of hardest to reach and the and that importance of inclusion. Because I know that for you in your research in Tanzania, and particularly on the kind of last mile questions, those hardest to reach populations, that question about the sort of reliable and accessible data on those very hardest to reach populations was at the heart of what you were trying to do. So what lessons do you think your research has brought for these more general discussions about how we can all focus on making sure that our data does cover those hardest to reach populations?
Thank you, Claire, and thank you to the Reach Alliance for having me back. It's wonderful to join the family again, albeit in a virtual context. So I'm joining the panel today in my capacity as a researcher from the 2018 to 19 Tanzania medical supply chain case study. And I think that the two lessons we can really learn from that case study with regards to tech and data is first, the importance of a sustained multi-stakeholder initiative, and second, the importance of also investing in the human ecosystem surrounding the technology itself. So just to brief recap of what the case study was about. It tries to capture this remarkable story of how Tanzania went from delivering medicines to 150 district warehouses to now direct delivery to more than 7,500 facilities, greatly expanding the visibility of the rural and remote clinics, not leaving them behind simply because they're invisible on the grid. So how did they do that? First, this 3-decade effort since the 1990s is the result of collaboration between many cross-sectoral stakeholders. We have a government of Tanzania who has 8-fold increased its health budget, demonstrating substantial political will. We have private consultancy practices that leverage their supply chain expertise and their software to help the government. We also have businesses such as Coca-Cola leveraging on the impetus that if a company could deliver cold beverages anywhere, then why can't we do the same for life-saving medicines? And of course, a broad network of NGOs, development partners, and local communities who all fed their expertise into the success of this initiative. So it's this collective long-term investment that I would say marks one of the lessons learned from the Tanzania case study. Second, one of the challenges that we encountered in the field with regards to the success of the program is actually the human ecosystem that surrounds the use of technologies. And I'll illustrate this with one of the stories from our trip back in April 2019 to visit Tanzania, where we were very lucky to have received a tour of the regional warehouse. And so the warehouse manager showed us a row of freshly painted geomap technology equipped trucks. And before we could compliment them on this fantastic infrastructure, the manager said, we have 20 trucks, but only 13 drivers. And these 7 trucks just sit in the parking lot, depreciating in value, and the high maintenance costs actually cause a huge budgetary strain to our warehouse. I think this is one of those moments where we realize that the human capital supporting the technology is equally important. This warehouse manager had struggled to find drivers who could operate and record data into the geomapping software, people who could understand pharmaceutical inventory and report on a real-time basis to the central hubs that are coordinating procurement, but also to have the resources to train and retain the people who might lack, for example, access to stable technology and stable electricity in a remote clinic, who might not know how to operate a laptop or use the integrated supply chain software that's being introduced from the government. And all of these factors play into the broader ecosystem that reminds us that technology and data don't just exist in a vacuum.
That's so important. It's interesting what you said about drivers. I thought you were going to say that they only had fuel to run a few of the trucks, because that's also been a huge constraint in some of the communities where I've worked. So thank you for that. And I think that's also a reminder that even though we think very much digitally now about data, we think about things that can just run through, that data that can just kind of run through cables almost without any without any friction. Of course, there is a very human infrastructure of moving people and stuff around countries at the heart of this that we absolutely mustn't forget about. So I want to turn now to some of these great questions that are coming in from the audience. Thank you very much. I'm afraid I'm not going to have a chance, all those listening, to get to all of your questions, but there are some common themes emerging. So the first one really is about, we've all talked, I think, in our different presentations about the importance of giving more agency, as I put it, and you've all said it in your own words, to marginalised and vulnerable communities to take charge of their own data generation, ownership and access. I'm interested in actually, that sounds easy to say, I suspect it's harder to do. I'm interested in your experiences of actually how we do that, and particularly the role of different stakeholders. This is going to be almost always a collaborative. Data is very much a team sport, and this is very much going to be a collaborative effort. Neal, I might turn to you first. I know you work closely with a number of NGOs and other actors who are trying to do just this. So I wonder if you might talk briefly to this question about the role of different stakeholders and some of the practicalities here.
Great question. There's a story that I love telling from way back in 2015 that I think gets to the heart of the question. So we have been working on a project called Visualize No Malaria with PATH, focused on malaria elimination in Zambia. And when we first started, we got malaria experts together with Tableau experts, and they built dashboards. And then we decided to workshop those dashboards with Ministry of Health staff and all levels. So people, higher levels all the way to people who are lower levels, sort of in the hierarchy. And every single visualization that was built by the experts had to be completely changed because the way that the experts saw data informing the world was not the way that the practitioners needed data to inform them to make better decisions. And so we rebuilt all of those dashboards. And we've seen that time and again across all of the projects everywhere around the world, where it's really important that all the stakeholders who use data participate in the process of really building the data visualizations and interpreting the data. And it's different depending on where you are in the organizational hierarchy. And it's important that we don't leave out the community health workers and the community members who also need to get benefit from data that's been collected from those communities. So hopefully that answers your question.
It certainly does. It's so interesting. It's never what you think it is, isn't it?
Exactly.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think, Verónica, there's a second question here that I might put to you, which is it's quite a challenging one. So apologies for that. It's about some of the ways in which the data that we collect can be affected by obviously the kind of social relationships that predate that data collection. And clearly we're hearing, I think, quite a lot now about the sort of decolonizing data and the way that data itself can sometimes reproduce or be seen to reproduce some troubling relationships. And I know that in some communities, the whole question of digital ID is somewhat wrapped up with this, that people fear. There are some communities where digital ID is hugely welcomed, and there are others where people, for good historical reasons, fear the intrusion into their lives of the power of the state and fear that this will be seen as this might be used to harm them. So I just wondered, practically, what do you think can be done today, and what are you doing to reduce the, as the questioner puts it, the friction caused by, I think this is a nice way to put it, the friction caused by the intergenerational trauma between data collection and the hardest to reach?
That's a very, very great question, and we can take hours and hours discussing all the how data or how decisions can reproduce, bias and problems that we have had for so long. For us, the work that we do is very regional based. So we work with a lot of partners and a lot of grassroots organizations and activists that are in the place, that are in the moment. And we believe that participation, as I mentioned before, is crucial for us. Sadly, this is not happening everywhere. And as you mentioned on the digital ID aspect of things, we've seen that sometimes these systems are kind of imposed, are there into the population, and they're just presented, or just pilot programs already been implemented, and no one consulted the population, no one opened that discussion to understand if this is exactly what we need or what we want. Sometimes we have even technologies deployed everywhere without any frameworks or legal frameworks to understand why, what is the reasoning, what are the objectives. And that kind of way, undermines the trust that we as a population have with our governments or other institutions. And that can replicate other fears that we might have from the past. So everything, can be at some point solved if we understand, if we involve everyone. For me, that's the first point that we need to have in our minds to overcome all these worries. We have seen multiple problems right now. If we can, kind of talk about another issue on COVID situations, a lot of technologies have been deployed in developing countries, and very little of them really worked out. And nowadays, if there's going to be a new app that the government will launch, for example, to provide anything, then you will have the population saying, maybe this is not the right moment, maybe we could use these resources for other things, and then you're undermining this trust that I'm saying. I'm happy to discuss more on this in another moment, but I think we are very short in time.
Thank you so much. No, really interesting. And as you say, there's always so much more that you could say. So I'm going to have the last question as something of an opportunity to invite you all to wrap up. And I'll come to you first, Angela, because you've been quiet for a while. I'm sure you have more to say. And this is really a question about where are the greatest gaps. So if we believe that data has a role to play, that data is part of the solution to closing gaps, to reducing inequalities, to solving the problems of the world. What are the priorities? What should we be focusing on first if we really want to make sure that we're maximising the opportunities of data to reach those hardest to reach people and improve their lives first and best? So you've got about a minute each. Angela, let me go to you first.
Wow, 60 seconds for $1 million question. Okay, I'll pick up where Neal started, left off last time, which is making sure that the data and its collection and interpretation are culturally relevant and absolutely meaningful for the people on the ground. And I think one of the successes we've seen in the Tanzania case study is that the flexibility of how data is collected is absolutely important. So the supply chain optimization not only picked up GPS data from vehicles and their routes, but also informal knowledge and local knowledge from the drivers. How are the weather and road conditions? How much does each clinic order in terms of volume? How long do drivers stop at each clinic? And all of these informal knowledge that really needs to become a part of the web of data is something that we see is incredibly important to reaching the absolute last mile. And a lot of the Reach Alliance's case studies will confirm that there needs to be nimble ways of accommodating how human experiences interact with technology and data.
Perfect, thank you. So listen to people, that's my first one. Verónica, what's your 60-second $1 million answer? I don't actually have $1 million, sorry.
Quite difficult. I think at this point, I will love to everyone here who are listening to us to review the work that lots of organizations are doing, mainly civil society, and support local civil society groups that are in your countries, in your communities. It's important to work with them. Sometimes coming from different realities, we don't trust on what's going on. And that really reduces our participation, and civic participation is crucial when we take decisions. So that will be my final message, to encourage everyone to reach out to local organizations, to activists working on the ground, and participate. This is a moment for participation.
Listen, participate. Neal, over to you.
I think that's awesome. There are two. We often think about, when we think about data, we often focus on the technology gap. And certainly there's a gap in government ministry abilities to, buy or get and use technology. But I think the bigger gap that is more important right now, and it gets to what Verónica just said, is really building the basic kind of digital and data skills at the community level, so they have the skills to engage with the data, advocate for themselves, help interpret the data for those who are delivering services and supports to the community. And that's something we're really focused on this year, is really figuring out how to try to do that at some reasonable scale. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, with a strong intention on reaching women, so that we don't really go to the default mechanism, which typically benefits men and not women. And so we need to be really intentional about that.
Thank you. So my 3 words here are: listen to communities, everyone participate, and let's share the technology and the skills so that we can make sure that everyone gets involved. So thank you so much. What a fantastic panel. Really, really enjoyed that discussion. We could have gone on all day, but you never can. So very much looking forward, all of you, to the next time that we can carry this on. Thank you so much to the audience. There were some fantastic questions that we couldn't get to, but I hope you'll agree with me that that was a really, really great discussion. And back to you, Anita.